Grew up at Park Street, teenage years. Ted Thrasher was a preacher, and anytime anybody would say, "Hey, can I have a book, a class book or whatever?" He'd always look at it. He said, it's $3.99 was most of the books we used. He said, "That'd be $39.90. That's what the markup is to borrow a book in Bible class." He always joked about that, and I remember that. 1 Kings 3 and verse 3 was the last verse that we looked at, if my memory serves me correct. And so we want to look at that as we begin. We're talking about Solomon in introduction to the book of Proverbs, and looking at some of the events in his family and in his life that would have helped to shape who he would have become. And so we looked at 1 Kings 3:3, and Solomon loved the Lord, walked in his statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. And so we see that Solomon was a godly man in most areas, but he did have a shortcoming. And so we've talked about David has just died, and Solomon is the new king, and he obtained that kingship because it was promised by David. It was fulfilled by God, right? God agreed to that, and so that was part of God's promise. But it was Nathan and his mother that helped to bring that about. And so as we come to the gift of wisdom, I want us to go back to Exodus 28 and verse 3. Exodus 28 and verse 3. This is the first time that we see the word wisdom used in the Bible. And so Exodus 28:3, "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that he may be an assembly of peoples." And I think I just read Genesis. Hold on, let me get to Exodus. If somebody's in Exodus, go ahead and read Exodus.
Exodus 28:3.
Yes, ma'am.
"So you shall speak to all who are gifted artisans, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister to me as priest."
Okay.
Is that it?
Yep, that's it. And so when we look at this, we see the spirit of wisdom. This was describing what type of individual? Tradesman or craftsman, right? And so the spirit of wisdom, the word here that we're looking, and so as you look at this in your handout, you have the Hebrew word and the definition, and you see wisdom in a good sense means skillful, wisdom, wisely, wit, right? And so these were the most capable men in the Hebrew camp in order to build the tabernacle. And they were able to fulfill or perform their trade to the fullest, right? And so that's why they were selected. And we see the root of this word means to be wise in mind, word, or act. It means exceeding, to teach wisdom, be or make self, show self, wise, deal wisely, or make wiser. Also go to Exodus 35. And we see examples of this word being used. And here, as we're introducing the idea of Solomon requests wisdom. And what we're doing is we're looking at some individuals who were stated, biblically speaking, as being wise. And so, Exodus 35. Somebody's there, go ahead and read that.
"He has filled them with skill to do all manner of work of the engraver and the designer and the tapestry maker, in blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine linen, and of the weaver, those who have every work, and those who design artistic works."
Okay. He has filled them with skill to do all manner of work, right? The application of their knowledge, they have skill. And as we looked at these words, one of the definitions is what? Skillful. Who gave them that skill or that ability? God, right? God, to do this. And so this was for a specific or special purpose. We jump ahead to Exodus 36:2. Somebody wants to read that.
Then Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab and every gifted artisan in whose heart the Lord had put wisdom,
All right. These were the men that were called to, as we see in the end of the verse, to do the work, right? They were able to take their knowledge and apply it well. And they're called gifted artisans or craftsmen. We might use the word today. And so we see these are craftsmen full of wisdom in relation to their skill. Same word. And so this is what Solomon requests, right? Was he requesting skills that would allow him to beat gold? No. He was asking for the wisdom or skills to perform his job, just like these men were able to do. Only what was his job? To be king, right? Make decisions, reign over his kingdom. And so he needed to be just as skillful in his trade of being king as these men were in the trade of building the tabernacle and the instruments of the tabernacle. And we see the word being used. Word wisdom is mentioned most often, and I started this list and it just kept growing. But there's a few books that don't use the word wisdom. There's a few books that use it once or twice, a few times. But these are the books that most often we see it's very prominent throughout the book. And so these books are the book of Exodus, 1 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And it's interesting because when you talk about the books of wisdom literature, what are the 5 books of wisdom? Can anybody name them? They're not in your handout. Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Now I'm drawing a blank right now. Gotta write it down. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. That's a prophet. It's not. I'm drawing a complete blank here. We're on the World Wide Web too. Anyway, we may get a comment about this. All right, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 10. Go Ecclesiastes 7:10. Job, that's it. Job. We saved ourselves before anybody got a comment in. All right, Proverbs 7:10. If somebody's there, go ahead and read it.
Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this.
Okay. Same word translated as wisely instead of wisdom. Okay. The same root word that we're talking about. Proverbs 28:26, also translated as wisely. Go ahead and read that, somebody, when you get there. That's right. And so here what we're talking about is the act of being wise, right? Wisdom. They had wisdom. This is the word describing that the act of them being performing wise things. Psalm 107:27. And I thought this was interesting because we don't use the word wit a lot, do we? We use wit very often. No. Sometimes we'll say someone lost their wits, but that's really older language than we use today, isn't it? And so here when we think about wisdom, this again is the same word translated instead of using the word wisdom as wits. If somebody's there, go ahead.
They rail to and fro and stagger like a drunken man, and they are at their wits' end.
Yeah, there you go. At their wits' end. Okay, they're out of wisdom. They're as far as they can go, right? When we use that word or that phrase, we're talking about we don't know what to do. And that's what they've driven themselves to here in the context. Solomon was blessed with wisdom from God. And that's where wisdom comes from. Is it any different for us? Not any different for us. And so as we go back to 1 Kings 3, 1 Kings 3, so we began tonight in verse 3, but we're going to go to verse 5. 1 Kings 3:5. And we're going to look at this account of Solomon requesting. And so I have here just the way as as I read through this is what I saw, and I tried to make it easy for me to try to memorize. And so in 1 Kings 3:5, we see the offer, then we see the request, we see the blessing, we see the bonus, and we see the excitement, right? And you may have your own words to describe these verses, but that's what I thought of as I studied these in preparation for this. And so 1 Kings 3, I'll go ahead and read this. It says, At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth and in righteousness and uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for long life for yourself, nor have asked for riches for yourself, nor have asked for life, or the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked in them, I will lengthen your days. Then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. And so as we begin in verse 5, what we see is the offer. And so here it tells us the setting of where Solomon was. And the offer was what? Ask what I shall give you, right? Have you ever thought about that? If you could have anything you wanted, what would you ask for? You know, there's a lot of movies about that, TV shows that were about that, right? And you think about that, and you see all kinds of crazy things. And what is the one thing that often people try to ask for? Remember, anybody watch Aladdin? Not condoning Disney movies in any way, but you can't ask for what? More wishes. You can't ask for more wishes. Well, okay, you're stuck to 3. But if you only had one, what would it be? God said to Solomon, you only have one. The difference between God making the offer and anyone else is what? He can fulfill it, right? And so when you think about that, think about what you might ask for. And the reason I bring this up, and I think it's important, is because I believe the background that we've been studying helped to shape Solomon so that he knew that he needed wisdom, right? Because that was the thing that he was lacking. And so you see that. So that's the offer in verse 5. Verses 6 through 10, we see the request. What was the request? Why did Solomon ask for wisdom? To rule the people. Was it for his benefit? You think about some of the things he could have asked for his benefit. You know, God named a long life. You didn't ask for a long life. You didn't ask for riches or fame.
Well, it's to his benefit to be a good ruler.
That's right. Because with wisdom come a lot of other gifts and glory, right? And so Solomon had to have enough wisdom to ask for more wisdom. And the reason we spent so much time looking over the past is, as I've said, because I think those events prepared him to ask for the right thing. Because as we study through the Bible, as we think about ourselves, how many people would ask for wisdom? Very few, right? As the first on our list. So we have the offer, the request, and then you have verses 11 through 13. What do you have? The blessing. What was the blessing?
Wisdom and riches.
Wisdom, riches, honor. So much that there shall not be, as we see in verse 13, not anyone like you among all the kings all your days. Now remember when the nation of Israel wanted to have a king, and they got Saul. What was the reason they wanted a king? So they could what? Be like everybody else. Was that a good thing for the nation? It wasn't a good thing. So then you have Saul with his reign, and people realized that maybe having a king wasn't all that great. Then you have David come in, and he wanted to serve God and build the temple. And then you have Solomon, who's not like any of the other kings, is he? And so then again, the nation really didn't get a king like the other nations. They got something far better, but it took 3 kings to get it. And then you have the bonus in verse 14. What's the bonus?
He lengthened his life if he followed God's commandments.
That's right. And that's the condition, right? The condition. If we could do a study, and that might be an interesting study or lesson sometime, of all the promises God made on condition. There's a lot of them, isn't there? The rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? Are all blessings conditional? No, but a lot of them are. And then you have the excitement, and that's in verse 15. What did Solomon do when he woke up and he realized that this was going to happen?
He put on a feast and offerings, peace offering, and
He showed his appreciation to God, didn't he?
Would that be a form of worship?
I believe so. At this time, they didn't have the temple, and you see the kings were offering some of the sacrifices. And so this is kind of a time in Israel's life when they're in limbo, spiritually speaking, I guess would be a good way to describe it. And so we see the excitement. So he made a feast for his servants. And then we come to point 2. Of those having knowledge, Solomon is the most noted. We talk about knowledge or wisdom. Go to 1 Kings 5, verse 12. And so this is after this event. And then we're going to, here in a moment, look at the event that showcases his first act of using his wisdom. 1 Kings 5:12. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. And so, what did God give Solomon? The wisdom to lead his people. He made a league with a nation that was needed in order to supply supplies, materials for the building of the tabernacle or the temple, not the tabernacle. 1 Kings 10, 4 through 8. If somebody gets there, go ahead and read this. We're on page 4. Flip the page. 1 Kings 10, 4 through 8. What we're seeing with these verses, we're seeing the fulfillment of God's promise or offer, his gift, and we're seeing Solomon using these. So go ahead.
And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no spirit in her. Then she said to the king, It was a true report which I heard in mine own land about your words and your wisdom. How far?
Through 8.
However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I stopped
Happy are you men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom.
Okay, so the Queen of Sheba came, and she said, I heard about your wisdom, but wow, this is better than what we heard. Right? How many times have you heard of something and you get there and say, it's not that great?
Yeah,
That happens a lot.
more times than.
This is opposite, isn't it? And so she gets there. Now, as we think about that, she says in verse 8, that cut Barb off on reading, it said, happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your what? Yeah. And what do we have? We have the book of Proverbs that we're preparing to study. Is that all that Solomon ever said? No, we just have probably a small snapshot of anything that he ever said or thought. But this is probably the best of the best. That's why God preserved it. It's what we needed today. And so if we think about that, and we go back in verse 5 and note that, because I believe this relates also to the promise, and not the promise of wisdom, but we see of riches and honor, right? Because when she came to him, it wasn't a wise old man back in a shack in the woods, right? What was it? It was Solomon that was wealthier, had more glory and honor than any of the other kings that lived in his time period. We jump ahead to 1 Kings 10:23, same chapter. Next verse is verse 23. Somebody, can you read that?
So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom.
Okay, so again, talking about Solomon. 1 Kings 11:41.
And the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon?
There you go. So we go to the Chronicles, sometimes called the Chronicles of the Kings. And so in 2 Chronicles 9, 2 Chronicles 9, 29 through 31. Does somebody want to read that? I'll go ahead. You saw the names. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, first and last, are they not written in the book of Nathan the prophet, in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the vision of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 days, and Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Right? Summation of his life, wasn't it? Okay. So we go to Solomon's first show of wisdom. And so here, this is immediately following. We're going back in 1 Kings 3. And so what we're seeing is right after the dream. And the dream ended in what verse? Verse 15. So you come to verse 16. And you have two women with a problem, right? I think this is interesting in a lot of different ways. One is because you have, and we'll read it here in a moment, but a lot of us are pretty familiar with the text, right? What are these women's profession? Yeah. And they're in where? What nation? Jerusalem. Or in Israel, right? Okay, so this is just interesting to think about that. But now two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. One woman said, O Lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the third day after I had given birth, that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house except the two of us in the house. What are they admitting? Who's at fault? One of them, right? They're the only ones that are accountable for the actions, okay? They're it. Verse 19, and this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while my maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And while I arose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was dead. But when I had examined him in the morning, indeed, he was he was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. And the first woman said, No, but the dead one is your son, and the living is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. And the king said, The one says, This is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. What was their story? Complicated, isn't it? Same story, right? Same story. Okay. We read through this, sometimes we get confused. I do. I got to go back and trace it out. But what do we know? They're saying the same thing. Okay. So verse 23, the king said, and so what happened in verses 10 through 15? Well, 4 through 15. What Solomon asked for? To do what? To lead, to make decisions, to discern. Do we need somebody that can discern in this situation? How would you like to make the call? Okay, you need some wisdom. And so you see this event. So the king said, both of you say the same thing. Verse 24, the king said, Bring me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. Which mother claimed the dead child? Neither one. What were they about to have to claim? Or half of one. Right? Do you think Solomon would actually follow through? No. But he knew through wisdom that one of them was going to have what?
Remorse for the child.
Compassion. Okay. You can read, and I didn't put it in your notes because I think that, we try to avoid reading too much into things. Some people say, well, if they're harlots, they're probably drunk, so they laid on their baby. We don't know. And so if you read articles or commentators or listen to lessons and someone states that, is that a possibility?
Most likely they have just given birth and they're exhausted and they slept right through whatever happened.
That could be it.
I mean, they caution you about that today.
Not
They
to sleep
caution
with your
you
kid.
not to sleep with a newborn infant in your
Yeah.
bed because that can happen
Yeah. But
to anybody.
that's right. It can happen. What's the cause? Doesn't tell us. So let's not read too much into this. Be careful with that. Then the woman, verse 26, whose son was living. You think Solomon knew which one was which? Mm-hmm. Debbie said, uh-huh. Yeah. Solomon knew. Then the woman, whose son was living, spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son, and she said, O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. Growing up, the rule was, if you cut the pie, the other one got to pick the piece. Is that fair? And I think we see a similar principle here. It's far more important than the pie. But the idea is Solomon knew what was right. Okay. And if we're the one cutting the pie and we get the leftovers, what are we going to make sure happens? Yeah, it's equal as it can be. And so she said, My Lord, give her the living child, by no means kill him. But the other said, Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. So the king answered and said, Give the first woman the living child, but by no means kill him. She's the mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer what? Justice. I'm going to tell you, if this account was on the 6 o'clock news, what would most people feel about the judge? Cruel. Right? Solomon, in his wisdom, was very, you might use the word aggressive. He wasn't passive, was he? But because of that, what did he find? He found the truth. And justice prevailed. And I think maybe we need more of that in our system today, right? We beat around the bush a lot. We don't want to pick on, we're not here to pick on our system. We've got a good system overall, but we've got some problems. All right, we only got 3 minutes. So we see Solomon's first show of wisdom. I thought it'd be pertinent for us to look at wisdom in the New Testament because we're introducing the book of Proverbs, a book of wisdom, right? So we're understanding what wisdom is, what a wise individual is. Wisdom comes from God, James 1:5. And I think this is, and I've got this more than one place in our introduction because I don't want us to forget about it, but James 1:5, and as I was thinking about this, a lot of times, and maybe I said this already, but I don't remember it in class, so we'll say it again. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it shall be given him. And so here it is. It's later on what we're going to work towards. But here's the thing. If any of you lacks wisdom, and I'm going to tell you that up until preparation for this lesson or this study, that I was always under the impression, probably based on the way it was taught and the way I understood it, that if any of you wants wisdom, what do? Ask God. And as I looked at this, that's not what it says. If you want wisdom, what does it say? If you lack wisdom. Here's the thing. It is an obligation for godly people to have wisdom. It's an obligation for Solomon to have wisdom. Why? So that people could see God's glory through his kingdom and his people, right? And so it's not an option. Well, I don't really want wisdom, because with wisdom also comes what? Responsibility. So people say, I don't want wisdom. I don't want to know. Aaron and I were joking before Bible study tonight. I said, what do you know? What do you say, Aaron? He said nothing, and it's what? It's easier that way. I think maybe he said better. But right? You think about that. But that's not what it says. And Solomon knew he was taking on a great responsibility, and he needed wisdom. We as God's people have taken on a great responsibility, and what do we need? Yeah. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And how many of us lack wisdom? All of us, right? Okay. We'll pick up here next week under wisdom in the New